The moment the announcement was made, Clara Whitfield felt the floor drop out from beneath her. The ballroom of Harrington Hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, laughter and music swirling through the gilded air, but all of it dimmed to a distant hum as Sir Thomas Everleigh raised his glass and declared his engagement to Miss Lydia Pemberton, an heiress whose fortune gleamed brighter than every chandelier combined. Clara stood near the wall, half hidden behind a potted fern, her gloved hand frozen on the stem of her champagne flute. The smile she had worn all evening, practiced, patient, hopeful, cracked like thin ice, and beneath it was nothing but cold, hollow shock. No one looked at her. No one noticed the companion of Lady Ashworth, the vicar's daughter with no dowry and no prospects. Thomas had danced with her last season, had whispered that her eyes held the softness of summer skis, had made her believe she was seen. But tonight, he toasted another woman, and Clara understood with brutal clarity that she had been a passing amusement, a placeholder for a heart that was never truly offered. The polite applause roared in her ears like an accusation. She could not breathe. She could not stay. She set down the glass with a hand she willed not to tremble and slipped through the terrace doors into the frozen night. The cold struck her like a slap, but it was cleaner than the suffocating warmth inside. Snow had begun to fall, silent and unhurried, dusting the balustrade and the skeletal rose bushes. Her breath puffed white. She walked without direction, her silk slippers soaking through, until she found a side door that led into a darkened corridor. The servants' passages would have been wiser, but her mind was a blur of pain, and she simply pushed open the first heavy oak door she encountered. It led into the library. The room was vast, smelling of leather and old wood, lit only by the orange glow of a dying fire. Shadows pooled in the corners. And there, in a high-backed chair facing the hearth, sat a man. He did not rise when she entered. He merely turned his head, the firelight carving his profile into something sharp and unreadable, a straight nose, a jaw that seemed hewn from stone, eyes the color of winter storms. Clara's heart lurched. She knew him at once. Everyone knew the Duke of Halstead, though few ever claimed to know him well. He was rumored to be cold, precise, a man who spoke only when necessary and smiled never. She had seen him at a distance at a dozen gatherings, always surrounded by a frost of deference, never lingering, never dancing. And now she had stumbled into his solitary refuge with tears freezing on her cheeks. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I did not realize I will go." Not. His voice was low and measured, entirely without warmth, yet somehow steadying. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "You are disturbing nothing but the dust." She hesitated, shame and sorrow warring within her. But the thought of returning to that ballroom, to the pitying glances, or worse, the utter indifference, was unbearable. She sank into the chair, keeping her spine rigid, her gaze fixed on the embers. The silence stretched, and she became acutely aware of her tear-streaked face, the wet hem of her gown, the inelegant sniff she could not suppress. He said nothing. He did not ask what had happened. He simply sat, a still, dark presence, until her breathing began to slow. After a long moment, he extended a handkerchief, plain white linen, monogrammed simply with an H. She took it, their gloved fingers not quite touching. "Thank you," she managed. "Tears do not diminish you," he said quietly, still staring into the fire. "They only prove you have a heart in a room full of painted smiles." The words were so unexpected, so tender in their starkness, that fresh tears pricked her eyes. But these were different, less bitter, more like a release. She dabbed her cheeks, inhaling the faint scent of sandalwood from the cloth. When she dared to look at him again, his expression had not shifted. He might have been carved from marble, and yet she sensed in that vast, quiet room a current of something she could not name, not pity, not curiosity, something closer to recognition. He rose then, tall and imposing, and moved toward the door without a glance back. "The fire will last another hour. Remain as long as you need, and do not let them see you cry, let them wonder." The door clicked shut behind him, and Clara was alone with the embers and the echo of a voice that had, for the first time all evening, made her feel less invisible. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet endurance. Clara returned to her duties as companion to her aunt, Lady Ashworth, a kind but distracted widow who required little more than a warm presence and an ear for her endless, gentle complaints. They resided in a modest manor on the edge of the Halstead estate, a fact that had once seemed incidental, but now hummed with a strange significance. Clara did not see the Duke again in the immediate aftermath of that night, but she thought of him more often than she wished to admit. She thought of the steady cadence of his voice, the way he had offered solace without demanding gratitude, the shocking simplicity of his words. He had seen her at her most shattered, and he had not turned away, Social invitations continued to arrive, for Lady Ashworth's connections were old and respectable, if not dazzling. Clara attended dinners and card parties with a new, quiet composure. Something had shifted within her. She no longer scanned ballrooms for Thomas Everleigh's golden head. She no longer angled for approval, no longer laughed a beat too quickly at the jokes of men who would never see her as an equal. She was still invisible to most, but the sting of it had dulled. She was learning to be invisible on her own terms. It was at a winter luncheon at the Viscountess Wexley's country house that she encountered the Duke again. The room was aflutter with gossip and the clink of teacups, and Clara had taken refuge near a frosted window, a neglected volume of poetry open on her lap. She sensed him before she saw him, a subtle shift in the air, the way voices around her grew hushed, and then resumed with a heightened, self-conscious brightness. He stood a few feet away, a cup of tea untouched in his hand, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse stumble. "Miss Whitfield," he said, inclining his head, "I trust you have been well, Grace." She rose and curtsied, her heart beating too fast. "I am quite well, thank you, and you?" "Well enough." A pause. "You are reading? That is a rare sight in a room full of conversation." She glanced down at the book, a faint warmth rising to her cheeks. "I find poetry a faithful companion when small talk grows thin." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or amusement passed through his eyes. "Then you are braver than most. Tell me, do you favor the Romantics, or are you a devotee of the Augustans?" The question was so unexpected, so deliberate, that Clara forgot for a moment where she was. "I lean toward the Romantics," she said, "though I suspect that marks me as sentimental, but I believe sentiment is not weakness, it is simply the courage to feel deeply." Was silent for a beat, and she feared she had overstepped. But then he said very softly, "I am not sure I have ever heard courage defined so accurately." Either of them could speak further. A sharp, silvery voice cut through the air. "Your Grace, there you are. I have been searching everywhere." Miss Elena Vance approached in a rustle of emerald silk, her golden curls perfectly arranged, her smile a study in practiced charm. She barely glanced at Clara before placing a gloved hand on the Duke's arm. "You promised to tell me about the improvements at Halstead Park. I am simply dying to hear." Duke's expression closed, his features returning to that familiar, unreadable mask. "Another time, Miss Vance." He stepped back, his gaze still lingering on Clara. "Enjoy your poetry, Miss Whitfield." And then he was gone, absorbed into the crowd, leaving Elena staring after him with narrowed eyes. Clara understood the warning in those eyes. She was nothing, a companion, a shadow. A Duke was not for the likes of her. The old shame threatened to resurface, but she forced it down. She had not sought his attention. She had not angled for it. She was simply learning to stand still in her own life and let the currents shift around her. Winter deepened, and with it came an invitation that set Lady Ashworth's household into a flurry of excitement. The Duke of Halstead was hosting a week-long gathering at Halstead Park, a grand affair of hunting parties, dinners, and a culminating ball. Invitations were coveted, and Lady Ashworth had secured one through a distant familial connection. Clara's feelings were a tangled knot of anticipation and dread. The thought of spending days under the same roof as the Duke, of navigating the sharp-eyed scrutiny of the ton, filled her with a quiet anxiety. But she packed her modest trunk with careful dignity, selecting her few well-made gowns, and resolved to meet whatever came with grace. Halstead Park was a masterpiece of old stone and climbing ivy, its windows blazing with welcome against the grey winter sky. Inside, it was a labyrinth of candlelit corridors, soaring ceilings, and fires that crackled in every hearth. Clara was given a small but comfortable chamber overlooking the formal gardens, now sleeping under a blanket of snow. On the first evening, as the guests assembled in the drawing room before dinner, she felt the familiar prickle of invisibility settle over her. Elena Vance was there, resplendent in sapphire, already orchestrating the laughter of a circle of admirers. There were other young ladies of fortune and beauty, and a handful of gentlemen who glanced at Clara with polite disinterest before turning to more promising prospects. She positioned herself near a window, watching the snow fall in the gathering dusk, when a deep voice spoke at her shoulder. "You have a habit of finding the edges of rooms." She turned. The Duke stood there, dressed in evening black, his expression as unreadable as ever, but there was a subtle softening around his eyes that she was beginning to recognize. "Perhaps I prefer the edges," she said. "The view is often clearer." "What do you see?" She hesitated, then said truthfully, "I see a room full of people performing for one another, and I see snow falling without any need to perform at all." Followed her gaze to the window. For a long moment they stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, watching the white flakes drift against the glass. It was the most peaceful she had felt in weeks. The dinner gong sounded, and he offered his arm. "Will you allow me to escort you in? I find I am weary of performance myself." A murmur rippled through the room as the Duke led Clara Whitfield to the dining table and seated her at his right hand. Elena's eyes burned like coals. Lady Ashworth looked torn between delight and alarm. Clara's own heart hammered so loudly she was certain the entire table could hear it. But she lifted her chin, met the curious stares with a gentle composure, and answered the Duke's quiet questions about her childhood in the vicarage, her love of old books, her thoughts on the estate's landscape. He listened with an attention that felt almost unnerving, as though every word she spoke was worth weighing. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. He sought her out in the library, where he found her tracing the spines of his leather-bound collection, in the conservatory, where she stood admiring the hothouse roses, on the snowy garden path, where she walked alone each afternoon. He never said anything overtly romantic. He discussed philosophy, estate management, the burdens of title and duty. He asked her opinion and listened as if her answer mattered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to let her see the man behind the mask. He spoke of his late father, a stern man who had demanded perfection, of his mother, who had died young and left a silence in the house that had never been filled. He confessed that he found social gatherings exhausting, that he had spent so many years building walls that he had forgotten how to open a door. Clara, in turn, found herself speaking of things she had never voiced aloud. The loneliness of her position, the ache of being overlooked, the quiet humiliation of watching Thomas Everleigh court another woman while she had nursed a foolish hope. She did not weep. She spoke with a clear-eyed honesty that surprised even herself. And the Duke listened without judgment, his stillness a kind of benediction. One evening they stood in the library, the same space that seemed to draw them together. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. He had been showing her a rare first edition of Wordsworth, and their hands had brushed on the leather cover. He did not pull away. She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in his grey eyes, something almost vulnerable. "Miss Whitfield," he began, his voice rougher than usual, "I find myself in a position I do not fully understand. You have become—" Was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Henry Stanton, a genial, silver-haired widower who had shown Clara a gentle kindness throughout the stay. "Ah, there you are, Miss Whitfield. I was hoping you might partner me for the charades this evening. My skills are appalling, and I require a sharp mind to rescue me." Duke's expression shuttered instantly. A chill settled over his features, and he stepped back. "Do not let me keep you." Clara hesitated, sensing the sudden frost. But Lord Henry's smile was warm and unassuming, and she had no desire to cling where she was not wanted. "Of course, Lord Henry, I should be delighted." She curtsied to the Duke and left the library, her heart heavy with confusion. The rest of the evening the Duke was distant. He did not seek her out. He stood near the fireplace during the games, arms crossed, watching her with a hooded gaze that she could not interpret. When she laughed at Lord Henry's feeble attempts at charades, the Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When Lord Henry fetched her a cup of warm cider, the Duke turned and left the room altogether. Clara felt the sting of his withdrawal as a physical ache. She had not imagined the growing warmth between them, had she? She replayed every conversation, every glance, searching for the misstep. And slowly, a cold realization seeped in. Perhaps he had simply remembered who she was. A companion, a nobody, a moment's curiosity, now satisfied and discarded. The old wound, the one she thought had healed, throbbed with fresh pain. The following afternoon, she was walking alone in the snow-covered rose garden when she heard voices around the corner of a yew hedge. She recognized Elena Vance's silvery tone at once. "Surely you cannot be serious, Your Grace. Everyone is speaking of it. The attention you pay that Whitfield creature is unseemly. People will begin to assume intentions." And then the Duke's voice, cold and clipped. "Miss Whitfield is a pleasant acquaintance, nothing more. She is of no consequence. I have no intention of marrying beneath my station." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She froze, her hand pressed to the rough bark of a tree, her breath stopped in her chest. The rest of the conversation faded to a meaningless hum, "of no consequence, beneath his station." She had heard those words before in different forms from different lips, but from him, the man who had looked at her as though she were the only person in a crowded room, they were a devastation beyond measure. She did not cry, she was too hollow for tears. She turned and walked back to the house, her steps steady, her face a careful mask of composure. Inside, she pleaded a headache and retreated to her chamber. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the snow falling beyond the window, and let the truth settle over her like a shroud. She had allowed herself to hope again. She had begun to believe that she might be seen, truly seen, by a man who understood her. She had been wrong. The pain was so acute it felt almost like relief, a clean break, a definitive end to uncertainty. That night she made a decision. She would not remain at Halstead Park. She would not linger where she was tolerated only as a diversion. She would return to Lady Ashworth's manor, and as soon as arrangements could be made, she would seek a position as a governess or a companion in a household far from here. She would build a life that depended on no one's approval but her own. For the first time, the thought did not feel like defeat. It felt like freedom. She informed Lady Ashworth of her decision the next morning, citing a desire to visit a sick friend. Her aunt, bewildered but accustomed to Clara's quiet self-sufficiency, did not protest. Clara packed her trunk with methodical calm. She did not seek out the Duke to say goodbye. She did not trust herself to see his cold, beautiful face without shattering. A hired carriage was brought round just as the early winter dusk began to fall. Snow was falling again, thick and silent, muffling the world in white. Clara walked down the stone steps of Halstead Park without looking back. She climbed into the carriage, pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, and let the horses carry her away. The Duke did not realize she had gone until dinner. He had spent the day wrestling with his own demons, replaying the conversation with Alina, despising himself for the cowardice of his words. He had spoken them out of fear, fear of the scrutiny, fear of the vulnerability she stirred in him, fear of the overwhelming, unfamiliar certainty that she was the one person who made the world feel less cold. The moment the words left his lips, he had wanted to call them back. But Alina's sharp eyes had been upon him, and he had retreated into his armor, the habit of a lifetime. When he entered the drawing room that evening and scanned the assembled guests, his heart seized. She was not there, he asked Lady Ashworth, his voice too tight, too urgent. Miss Whitfield, is she unwell? Lady Ashworth blinked up at him, flustered. Oh, Your Grace, did you not know? She has left, an urgent matter with a friend. She departed hours ago. The world tilted. Left without a word, without giving him a chance to explain, to apologize, to fall to his knees and beg her to understand that he was a fool, a proud, terrified fool. He turned on his heel and strode from the room, ignoring the startled whispers that trailed in his wake. He went to the stables himself, his mind a roaring blank of panic. He ordered his fastest horse saddled, ignoring the stable master's protests about the worsening snow. The roads would be treacherous, but he did not care. He had to reach her before she disappeared from his life entirely. He had to tell her the truth. The ride was a blur of frozen wind and stinging snow. The horse's hooves crunched through the drifts, and the light was fading fast. He pushed on, following the main road toward the Ashworth estate, dread coiling in his stomach. He had never been a man of grand gestures. He had never allowed himself to need anyone. But the thought of a future without Clara Whitfield's quiet smile, her steady presence, her fearless honesty, was a desolation he could not endure. Ahead, through the swirling white, he saw a dark shape. A carriage halted at the side of the road. His heart lurched. He urged the horse forward and saw the driver struggling with a loose wheel, the horses stamping restlessly. And there, standing beside the carriage in the falling snow, wrapped in a grey cloak, was Clara. She turned at the sound of his approach and her eyes widened. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, his boots sinking into the snow. He was breathless, hatless, his greatcoat dusted with white. He must have looked like a madman. He felt like one, Clara. Her name broke from his lips, raw and urgent. He had never called her by her Christian name before. It felt sacred and terrifying. She took a step back, her face pale and set. Your Grace, you should not have come. I had to. He closed the distance between them, heedless of the snow soaking through his clothes. The things I said, I heard them the moment they left my mouth, and I have been drowning in shame ever since. They were not the truth. They were the words of a coward who has spent his entire life hiding. You must let me explain. Is nothing to explain, she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. You spoke your mind. I am of no consequence. You made that painfully clear. I am grateful for the clarity, truly. It has shown me the path I must take. No, the word was a desperate plea. That path is built on a lie. You are not of no consequence. You are the only person of any consequence in my entire empty existence. I did not know what I was saying. I was afraid of Alina's gossip, yes, but more afraid of what I felt. I have spent so long building walls around myself that I did not know how to let anyone in. You breached them without trying, and I was terrified. She stared at him, snowflakes catching in her lashes, her expression unreadable. Terrified of what? Of this. He gestured between them, his hand trembling. Of needing you, of losing you, of the absolute certainty that if I let myself love you, I would be utterly, irrevocably ruined for anything else. And I said those horrible false words because I thought if I could push you away, I could go back to being the cold, solitary man I was before I knew you. But I cannot. I do not want to. You have shown me what it is to be seen, and I would rather be ruined by you than safe without you." Silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of snow and the distant jingle of the carriage horses. Clara's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You hurt me, more than Thomas ever did, because I had let myself trust you. I had let myself believe that someone like you could see someone like me. I know." He bowed his head, a duke standing in the snow, humbled and raw. "I know I hurt you. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn back your trust, if you will let me. I am not asking for forgiveness tonight. I am only asking for a chance to prove that the man who sat with you by the fire, who listened to you, who felt his frozen heart begin to thaw, that man is the real one, not the coward who spoke to Elena." She was quiet for a long, aching moment. Then she took a small step toward him, her cloak brushing his coat. "You remembered my name," she said softly, almost wonderingly. "That night in the library, the first time we met. You remembered my name even though I had never told you. You must have asked someone. I have held on to that for weeks, turning it over in my mind like a precious stone. It was the first time I felt seen." Lifted his head, his grey eyes searching hers. "I asked your aunt that very night. I could not stop thinking about the woman who cried in the library and then dried her tears and walked back into the world with her head held high. You were the bravest person I had ever encountered, and I wanted to know your name. I have not stopped thinking about you since." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling now, a fragile, trembling thing. "I thought I could walk away. I was ready to. I had finally learned that my worth does not depend on whether a man chooses me. I was going to build my own life." "You still can," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But please, let me build it with you. Not as a duke and a companion, as Alexander and Clara, two people who found each other in the cold and decided to be brave together." She reached out and took his gloved hand in hers. The snow fell around them, soft and silent, blanketing the world in a hush of white. "Alexander," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "I believe I have been waiting to call you that for a long time." Let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her gently into his arms. They stood like that, two figures in the snow, as the carriage driver discreetly busied himself with the wheel. The cold was forgotten. The past, with all its hurts and humiliations, began to fade like a bad dream upon waking. He pressed a kiss to her hair, her temple, the corner of her mouth, tender, reverent, a promise. "I will never give you cause to doubt me again," he murmured against her skin. "You are not beneath me, you are above everything. You are the only star in a sky I thought was empty." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, and what she saw there was not a duke, not a cold aristocrat, but a man laid bare, vulnerable and hopeful and utterly hers. "Then let us go back," she said, "together." They returned to Halstead Park in the carriage, the wheel having been secured, his horse tethered behind. The guests were still assembled when they walked through the great doors, snow-dusted and hand in hand. The room fell silent. Elena Vance's face went pale, then flushed with fury. Lady Ashworth gasped. Lord Henry Stanton smiled a quiet, knowing smile. The Duke did not address the room. He simply turned to Clara, lifted her hand to his lips, and said, loud enough for all to hear, "I have been a fool, and this woman has been gracious enough to forgive me. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure the entire world knows her name, and that name will soon be Montclair." A murmur swept through the crowd, but Clara heard none of it. She saw only the man before her, the man who had once been a shadow in a library and was now the blazing center of her world. The snow continued to fall outside the tall windows, but inside, for the first time in her life, she felt nothing but warmth. The wedding took place on a morning in early spring, in the small stone chapel on the Halstead estate. The snow had melted, leaving the hills green and dotted with wildflowers, but in Clara's memory, it was always that winter snowfall she returned to, the moment when everything changed, when she had found the courage to leave and in leaving had been found. Alexander stood at the altar, his grey eyes soft with a joy he no longer tried to hide, and when she walked toward him, she did so with the steady, radiant confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she deserved. They said their vows in voices that trembled with emotion. The small gathering of guests, Lady Ashworth, Lord Henry Stanton, a handful of true friends, wept without shame, and when the Duke of Halstead kissed his bride, he did so with a reverence that spoke of a lifetime of devotion yet to come. That evening, as the sun set over Halstead Park, they stood together in the library, the same room where their story had begun. The fire crackled, the shelves glowed with leather and gold, and outside the window a light dusting of late snow fell unseasonably, a final gift from the winter that had brought them together. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his lips brushing her ear. The night the snow fell, I remembered your name. And tonight the snow falls again, and your name is the only prayer I know. She turned in his embrace and looked up at him, her eyes shining. And what is my name? He smiled, a true, full smile, the first she had ever seen on his stern face, and said, home. The snow whispered against the glass, and they stood entwined in the firelight, two hearts that had once been lost in the cold, now found, now forever.